My name is Matt Jarrett, and I'm a civil engineering student here at Washington State University. I'm here to talk to you about the depot team and our site analysis as we move forward in the NARA project. We think it's actually lay out the NARA supply chain, because that's where we're really working, and our goal is to move 1 million bone dry tons, or BDT, as we'll call it for this presentation, through that supply chain as quickly and efficiently as we possibly can. But what's tricky for us is we have a few different routes we can take. A liquids depot and a solids depot. The solids depot is a little bit simpler and it will just rely on the physical breakdown of our biomass. The liquids depot will involve a few processes and will be a little more complex. I'll get into that later though. To help understand this, we've highlighted on that supply chain where each of these depots is primarily taking place, just to get an idea of the two types of depots. We have the solids and the liquids. The solids, as I said earlier, is just rather simple, and that will limit our factors that we have to consider when we. And our sites that we'll be looking at are sawmills. Whereas with the liquids depot, our primary site that we're going to be looking at is going to be pulp and paper. The liquids depot is going to have a lot more factors to consider because of all the more complicated processes. Here is the summation of our factors. And don't worry or be overwhelmed by that big list right now. We'll get into that later. But as you can see, there are some similar factors, some that aren't similar for the two sites. Where these factors come from are the TEA, or the techno-economic analysis that we've been provided by for the NARA. Each of these circles represents two significant portions of the NARA project: capital expenditures as well as operational expenditures. The way we deal with these and to make our factors is by setting up a proportion of how much a certain factor costs relative to the entire costs of the whole operation. And we multiply it by 20. I'll get to that later though. And for both the total cost and the individual factor cost, we're going to assume a 25-year payback period on those capital expenditures, and then sum those with the operational expenditures every year. Within each of these, we'll have an individual weighting score of 5 to -5. Each will be evaluated from that -5 to a 5 and compiled in an Excel spreadsheet like you see here. Excuse the quality, this is directly what we are working with right now. And as you see, each factor can receive up to a 5 for a point, and since they all sum to 20 that I mentioned earlier, we get a potential score for a perfect site of 100 points. And likewise with a -5 for every value, or the worst potential site, you get a -100. And this allows us to evaluate different sites and directly compare their benefits. Again, they all came to this. But we have 14 on there, but we have hundreds of sites to look at. And it's not realistic for us to apply an individual approach to each site. So where we decided to start was with a geographic hotspot. These factors highlighted here can be compiled using GIS software for different needs and set up buffers, as my teammates will now explain.
Hello, my name is Stephen Keith. I'm IDX studio. I'm also a civil engineering student here at WSU. I'm here to talk about the biomass densities were given and created a plot in GIS. From there, we used a forest ownership shapefile to cut out federal lands or non-RSF2 so that we could just kind of forget about those for a second and actually see the usable biomass at each site. From there, we used an assumed 100 bone dry tons per square mile uniform density to radius and created a 28-mile buffer. We intersected that data with the biomass and exported that to Excel so that we could multiply the area by the volume, or multiply the area by the density so that we can get a residual volume at each. For example, Longview Fiber Company, shown in the circle, had a biomass volume of 600,000 bone dry tons. We did this for every single site and rated them assuming that 250 by tons was kind of our neutral value. We did this because we had over 70 sites that were our kind of assumed maximum. So then we could justify ranking our top 40 sites to actually differentiate each other. If we had not done this, our top 40 sites would have all received a score of 5 at 12 and 6 respectively for a solid and liquid depot, and would have received the maximum score. So it was kind of a way for us to differentiate between each of the sites. And next you will hear about.
Hi, my name is Ian Smith. I'm also at Washington State University studying civil engineering, and I'm part of the IDX team here in IDX Studios. And so one of the factors that we found that would be important for transportation is port access. And so on the solid depot side, when the output is just wood chips, we found that this factor wouldn't be as a viable transportation method because the cost of the port or the barge is more than the cost of the material, which is the wood chips. And so for liquids depot, when you have a higher energy content in there, which is the sugar slurry coming out of that liquids depot, a more costly mode of transportation now becomes more viable. So we based our port access on a 30 kilometers radius as the zero factor. That comes out to 18.5 miles. And that was based on the research that we had done, that once you trucking the material 18 points, that's kind of your break-even point. So after that mileage, now you're paying more to get to the port and then transport it that way. So it's more viable just to truck it once you get out that 18.5 mile from the port. So when we're doing this, we have 0, the break-even, and then we just linearly went up to a 5 factor to on-site, and then -5 if you're above or farther out than 37 miles. Each time we'll do a factor for a different liquid depot, and in this case, liquid depot was a factor of 1, or a weight of 1 out of the total. And so from here, we can move on to social capital, which my colleague Brian will talk about.
Hi, I'm Brian Hansen from the University of Leto studying bioenergy engineering, and I'm doing social capital. Social capital is measured by some factors such as voter turnout and social gathering locations. This is to show how healthy a community is and if you're going to be able to have happy employees. The Creative Vitality Index is an indicator of that region's economic health in the nonprofits, arts division. So it's like more about reflecting the relative economic health of the creative economy. This may help us by showing its ability of a community to accept new environmentally friendly positions. Poverty rate, NARA's main goals is to try and provide high-tech, high-paying jobs in low economic areas, help out the rural areas that are suffering. And this is measured by the uninsured, unemployed, and the lack of health care. So we rated poorer places higher, as these are places that could use our help. And now, Cody will be talking about electricity rates.
Hi, I'm Cody Lane. I'm an environmental engineering student here at Washington State University, and I am part of the IDX team. I'm here to talk to you about a few of the different factors of the electricity rates. So the electricity rates, as you can kind of see here, how we examined them was we took electricity rates for Washington, Oregon, and Montana, and from there we were able to kind of find like the break-even cost, which is kind of shown as our zero factor. And from there, we could kind of break as in the higher rating with the cheaper cents per kilowatt to the most expensive cents per kilowatt. And in the regions you kind of can see here, the darker regions are kind of near like the Seattle area and Washington, and some kind of on the coast, and has pretty good electricity rates, and this can help determine where a site might be selected for, even though the costs are kind of, or the factor's kind of low, but this can kind of is an increased incentive for sites to kind of look at this because it will reduce the overall cost, operation cost of a site. And so with the amount of money going through the operation and all this can kind of help slowly reduce those costs with the lower electricity rates. And now that they've kind of talked about each of these layers that are kind of shown, you can we're going to create an overall layer so that kind of will show the hotspots in the areas that that we are able to examine now, and kind of go further into depth and help find sites that can be potentially viable for this project. And as you can see from this, you have the sites over here kind of along the coast, and you have some up in here in Idaho and Montana. Idaho and Montana. And these are kind of created from all those layers that we just talked about. And with these layers, you see that the darker the green from once they all compiled, we were able to get these kind of hotspots. And this hotspot compilation, all three different kind of mill types. So you can see the red dots are the paper mills. You have the blue squares, which are your pulp and paper mills, and then you have the orange triangles shown up on there that are your chip mills. And from there, with these hotspots, we went from narrowing down hundreds and hundreds of sites, able to kind of get to where we could eventually top 40 sites. And then when looking at all these sites, we can kind of step of factors to kind of help narrow down to which sites we want to look at. And so quickly I'll talk about the sites we're going to be looking at, or the factors we'll be looking at to kind of help determine like the next step. And so you can see that some of them have like liquid and solids. Some of them are ranked and some of them are not. Looking at road access, we're going to be looking at rail access, facility size, facility status, facility type, the proximity to an IBR refinery, and then labor costs. And so the first one is kind of road access, and this is kind of, it's only for this factor only looked in the liquid depot, because when we did our original biomass calculations, the input road access was already put into that factor. And this is kind of important because this determines the proximity to like major highways and interstates, and this kind of could greatly reduce the cost for the output for transportation. And like as it says, the closer the proximity, the cheaper the transportation. So when we look as a liquid depot, when we're trying to get going to the next step of the process, how close are we to roads? And now we're going to look at rails, and this factor is kind of similar for both because it can create large quantities and can ship them out easier. And this would help, like, again, reduce transportation costs. And we were able to look using files and being able to measure how far, whether certain sites had rail on site or how close they were, so that you could go from road to rail, and we were able to rank them accordingly. And then size. So this is kind of determined when looking at the site, how much biomass could potentially be stored on the site, or how big the facility is and kind of what's on it. And so the more it can store, so it can ensure continuous operation year round. And so we kind of have our rankings, as you can see, 110 being like the highest ranking of acreage, down to all the way being one of the smaller sites. And then we also have facility status. So there's 3 different statuses. We have operational, we have decommissioned, and we have mothballed. And these are important because if it's in operation, then it'll take less capital costs for it to potentially go up and running again, or like to create it in the way that we want to use it for. And this is going to be both for solids and liquids. And then where you have decommission, where you will have to build some infrastructure or get it going again, and then you have mothball, which needs a lot of work. And so then with the facility type, this kind of goes into the pre-treatment process. So the facility type dictates the ability to be retrofitted to become a liquid depot. This is like only for liquid, like I said. And this is kind of a high factor because this is like the 3 different factors here, or the ones that can be actually chosen unless you got a -5, are the ones that can actually be used in the pre-treatment process. And NARA chose these because these are ideal for trying to eventually create liquid biofuel. As this goes along, when chips would be the processes that chips would go through in order to go to the next step.
Integrated biorefinery proximity is important to reduce the cost of transporting the higher density biofuel to this next step along our chain. We have different ranges showing from about 0.5 miles would be adequate if this was located right on the site. It would have virtually no transportation costs, and we gave a factor of negative 30 miles for negative 30 or more than, and this is just, we're trying to reduce our costs in our transportation.
Oh, I'm doing this.
Also, cost. This is we looked at the state averages from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and compared the 4-state region. This can help us compare if our business to other businesses, if it's going to have more, if it's going to be something that's more desirable in the area. If it's a low paying, if the average of the state is lower, then there's have more demand to take on our jobs, and which also we could reduce the cost of paying our employees.
So we have gone over all the different factors that kind of go into these different that we have. So here's all the weights again, and I just want to here. And the next couple slides will be us picking our top 20 sites, evaluating the top 20 sites will be out of those hotspots that we pointed out earlier. So here we have the top 5, and so you can see by each, so the top five Solids Depot, each broken into different components that they have, the ratings, the 5 through -5 ratings, as well as the weights over the top of them. And so you can see here on Solids Depot, there are a couple rows that are completely zeros. Those are things that we found that there wasn't enough deviation in them to account for a 5 to -5 rating. So if there's across the whole 4-state region, if there's no deviation, there's no point to give them a higher or lower rating because no matter where we are, all those factors will be the same. And so the second one you see over is the transportation input, and that actually got sucked into the biomass densities, forest residuals, because that cost in there into account of going out and getting that biomass. See the top 5, and see how those are broken down. And then here, and I'd like you guys to just kind of look over these, and we really want some feedback from if anyone knows of people that have these different sites, and we really want to get into the sites and be able to communicate with these different people and get more of more details of these different sites so we can better evaluate their ability to be transformed into a Solids Depot. And so I'll just take some time for you to read over those. These top 1 through 5 you saw in the ratings in the last slide, and is 20. The number 20 is a lot worse than number 1. They are all viable sites, and I'd like to really say that there are plenty of viable sites out there that we don't have on here. These just happen to be the most beneficial of all the viable sites. Here is the breakdown on a liquids depot. You can see all our factors on top there, and then our top 5 sites for. And so, again, you see there's some zeros in there, and that actually comes from a research we haven't quite done yet. So natural gas costs, we don't have the numbers for the natural gas costs across the counties on the 4-state region. We do have proximity, and we'll be working with that and doing buffers like we did before with the ports and stuff like that, the buffers around those. And that'll be based on how much infrastructure we can put in by how much money has been delegated to infrastructure of utilities. And so that's why those are zeroed out right now. They're not beneficial or negative, and we can get those in later. Storage and site size is something we'll have to do when we be able to communicate with the different sites, because right now we don't have any way of seeing how much acreage each have. And so once we go in and talk to those people, we can get a more of a idea of how much storage they have. So those are the top 5, and you can see the rankings. One side, and you can see the total value accounts that they have. And here are the top 20, just like we had top 20 Liquid Depot, like we just had the top 20 Solids Depot. And I would like to reiterate, these are not the only viable sites. So I just like to make sure that people out there that do think this is a great idea and they want to get this going, please contact us. And so, because anything we can get, we'll definitely discuss and see the viability of your site and whatnot. So we have the top 5 here that you saw on the last slide, and then top 20 throughout here. So I just want you to look over this for a little bit. All right, and we have the next person coming in, and we'll take any go to the next steps and take any questions you might have.
Hello. Our next steps are to investigate each site in more depth and detail. We'd also like help acquiring any additional information, for example, natural gas costs and any other assets that these sites previously mentioned you think may be beneficial to our analysis and future development of this project. We'd like to continue to refine our asset factors based on our weighting system and based on our ranking. And the more information we get and collect from everybody, the more detailed and refined our analysis can be. And our final continue to narrow the site selection to get the absolute best located site. I'd like to keep in mind the NARA supply chain, where we are from biomass to sugars with the Solids Depot and the Liquids Depot project. Again, if you have any information that may help us with our supply chain analysis, please contact us. And if you can provide information on getting a site visit set up for us to actually get on site and assess what was there, please contact us. Thank you very much. Here are our references and our images, and tuning in.
All right, so far that you've seen the depot, I'm going to give you guys a couple minutes here. Again, on the right below this video, if you guys are on our website, you'll see a form for filling out some questions. If you guys have questions or comments about their presentation, go ahead and fill that out now. I'll give you just 2 or 3 minutes, and then we're going to get into the conversion team come in and give their presentation. Once the conversion team is done with their presentation, we will answer as many of these questions as possible. So again, questions, contacts, anything that might help us out in the process of this site selection, please go ahead and fill out that form, and we'll be back with you in just about 2 minutes. This will be the conversion team coming up here in just a second. We'll be right back.
is Christian Williams. I'm a part of the conversion team along with Sydney Deaton, Anna Martin, and Kyle Stevens. And we're part of the IDX class here at Washington State University. We're all civil engineers. We're working with NARA to help them find a viable way to convert woody biomass to jet fuel. So I want to take you a little more in depth within this process and the supply to utilize. So first I want to, at the bottom left here, take the biomass in the form of forest residues from the forest and break it into pellets and chips. And once that is done, it will be a pre-treatment plant where the wood is broken down, separating the lignin, which is the structure of the wood, from the carbohydrates and sugars. And then after this is it is sent to hydrolysis, breaks down the carbohydrates further into simple sugars, which are then sent to the fermentation to introduce a yeast, and that ferments into isobutanol, which is then taken to a refining stage that converts the isobutanol into a kerosene, which will then be converted, or which will then be mixed 50-50 jet fuel. And we are part of the conversion team, as I said earlier, which is sugars, the hydrolysis stage, and going through the process to jet fuel. Just to give you an idea of the fuel consumption with Northwest, this map shows that Washington is the top consumer of jet fuel, and Oregon is the second most when it comes to jet fuel, with Idaho and Montana coming far behind in third and fourth. And to break that down further, we have airports listed within the Pacific Northwest. As you can see, Seattle, Tacoma International is the top consumer within our region, and Portland International is the second largest consumer. And there are also Air Force bases mixed in with these that also consume jet fuel. And next, Sydney will introduce how we determine the capital costs and the scores for those.
Well, so we were looking at the models. There are two options for our conversion process. There's an integrated biorefinery, and there's also a conversion plant option. The integrated biorefinery option takes the process all the way from start to finish, so from the woody biomass all the way up through jet fuel. And the conversion plant process is a solids depot option, so it takes the sugars produced by the solids depot and then converts them into the. So we're looking at two different models. So the factors that we used to come up with our best site were based off of costs for the most part. There were a couple other factors that weren't as easily defined, but we looked at capital costs or CapEx and operational expenditures or OpEx, which when it comes to the total costs of siting, CapEx accounts for 55% and OpEx is 45%. So we were trying to decide what types of sites would be most suitable for integrated biorefineries and the liquids depot model. We used the reading provided by Natalie Martinkus, biorefinery asset, existing assets suitability, where we were able to see what existing site infrastructure and equipment that we could use for our processes. So for example, a sulfite mill has equipment in place that can cover like 100% pre-treatment, which is a large chunk of the capital expenditures for creating one of these refineries. And so we totaled these costs, and it also for the refining part, it only has some of the infrastructure present. So you total the costs that would need to be present for an integrated biorefinery, for a depot, the liquids depot model. We looked at which type of site most money for each type of model. And so, for example, in the liquid depot model, a oil refinery can save approximately 84% of the capital costs with the infrastructure. And then that would get a perfect score of 5. That's the best type of facility. And then percentage of cost saved for the other types of facilities, we scaled it to that 5 for each type.
So I'm going to actually take you back a couple of slides before I get into our weighting factors. So NARA has a couple of facility that they are looking at. One is an integrated biorefinery where every step of the process in the supply chain takes place at one facility. And there's also another option that they're looking at where the depots are where the processes are broken up, so separate facilities, such as a liquid depot where it takes you through the hydrolysis, and there's a facility for fermentation, and then there's the solids depot where it takes you through pre-conversion, and then it's a separate facility for pre-treatment. Alright, so back to the weighting process. What we did to weight our factors was we used plus, pound, or minus, which means more important. The plus is means that a factor is more important than another factor, of equal importance to another factor, and a minus is to another factor. And as you can see, we have our factors on the top and on the far left. And as you can see from the top, we broke it down into natural capital and social capital, with built capital being existing infrastructure to utilize, and natural capital being communities that we can utilize. So we're going to start on the left side of the table and work our way towards the right, comparing facilities as we go along. So I'm going to use transportation as an example. So we'll start with transportation, water treatment, and once that's done, we'll move along farther right to type of facility, which, as you can see, transportation is a minus, which is of less importance facility. And at the end, far right of the table, we totaled the number of minuses from that. So as you can see, transportation has 1. And then if you move along further across the table, was more natural gas from our determination, and so it received 3 points there. And at the end, we totaled it to have 4 pluses. It has a pound when compared to distance to market, so it is of equal importance, and we totaled that to be 2. Now, just to clarify how we determine the relative to other factors, we used the techno-economic analysis, which provided monetary values for most of these factors, and so if it costs more, we made that more important to reduce our capital costs. So once we had the amount of pluses, minuses, and pounds, we added we multiplied them by the number, and that gave us a point score. So we took the total point score for that factor and divided that by the total point score for all factors to give. Once we did that, we multiplied the weight by 20 to give us a weighted score out of 20. And then we scaled it based on the techno-economic analysis, based on the factor compared to the amount of total cost, still out of 20. And this helped us to better account for outliers. And then for the integrated biorefinery, it was the same process. However, we took out the pre-conversion because it is using one facility rather than separate, so that transportation cost goes away. And biomass availability, because processes are in one plant, the amount of wood became much more important for this. And next up, Anna is going to take you through how we scored these factors.
Okay, the next step in our site selection process was a type of score justification in order to give scores to each. Just to be clear, we're only table in here for our conversion plant and not our IBR plant. The only difference between the two tables is that distance from pre-conversion, which is down here, would be replaced with the biomass availability. So the first thing we looked at was the wastewater treatment highlighted in that blue box. A -5 would be if the facility did not have a wastewater plant, and a score of 5 would mean it does have a wastewater treatment plant. Natural gas is another integral part of our so it basically either got a yes or a no. -5 if natural gas is not available on site, or a 5 if natural gas is available on site. Transportation costs, these we mostly looked at the type of transportation or how close different types of transportation were available. For example, a -5 score would mean there are no major roads or rail within 20 miles and no ports within 10 miles of a given facility. A score of 5 would mean there is interstate within a mile or there is port or rail on site. So for the conversion plant, distance from pre-conversion was an important factor because these add transportation costs into the process. So a -5 score would be there is no pre-conversion site within 30 miles. A score of 5 would be there is pre-conversion within 5 miles. Distance to market, which is rated equally as distance to pre-conversion. A -5 score would be no market within 100 miles. A score of 5 would be a market within 1 mile. Just to be clear, markets are our endpoints that we are selling our jet fuel to. These can include airports or Air Force bases. And the last thing we looked at for our score justification was electricity rates. For the conversion process, we will be requiring a boiler. This boiler will generate extra electricity that we could potentially sell back. So for us, it's important to be in an area where there is a high cost of, or high electricity rates. So a score of 5 would either be there's a boiler on site producing 50 megawatts of power, or there would be a high rate of electricity. And a score of -5 is if the electricity is inexpensive in the area. Next up will be
Alright, so this is a map of the forest residual density, and you can see that the darker colors mean there's a higher forest residual density, and the lighter colors mean that there's less forest residual density in that location. And you can see that for this, the integrated biorefinery has a much higher weight, and that's because we will be getting the biomass and processing it all in one location, whereas with the liquids depot method, getting the biomass from the solids depot, and we use this to kind of account will be to their sites because we did not have them at this time. And this is natural gas. You can see all the pipelines here. This is part of our natural capital. Natural gas is used in many of our operations for refinery. We use this to see how close it would be to the existing pipelines so that we can gauge a startup cost it would be to access these in our facilities. Electricity rates are also part of our natural capital. We observed in our research that the types of facilities we have are using boilers to create excess electricity actually and sell it back to the grid. So that's why we have the darker or higher weights with the higher electricity costs, so you can sell it back at a higher price. Next up is transportation, which is part of our built capital. They have a relatively high weight, and we took into account major highways, rail lines, and these were weighted highly because transportation is very costly, and we need to transport the biomass to our facilities, and then we need to transport the liquids to the markets. Facility is also part of our built capital, and these have some of the highest weights, and that's because they have a massive impact on our capital costs of creating these facilities. And for this research, we took into ethanol plants, petroleum refineries, petroleum terminals, and pulp and paper mills. And you also note that it has a higher weight for the integrated biorefinery because there's much higher capital costs with an integrated biorefinery than with a depot, or liquids depot. And next up is social capital. So we took into account social factors to try and account for the ability of the community to support our cause. And this was put in place so that we wouldn't choose a site for its biogeophysical attributes and then not be able to implement this site due to the social factors turning against us. And so first up is the poverty rate, which is determined by the poverty index, which takes into account unemployment rates, uninsured people, and the poverty rates in children and a couple other factors. And so we determined that the better for us would be to how, so the impoverished the county would be better for us because they would be more accepting of the jobs that we would be providing to them. And next up is the Creative Vitality Index. Vitality Index is a measure of, it is the number of people in creative jobs and the amount of revenue that is created in those industries. And this is trying to get a gauge on how open the society is. So that we determined that if they were more open, then they would be more willing and accepting of our plans. So the more open was the higher number. And last up was social capital. So social capital is a gauge of voter turnout and like number of community that a community will have. So we use this to try and get a gauge on how much a community can come together to support the cause. And so we assumed that the community would be supporting our cause, so we gave the higher numbers a darker color and a better weight. And it should also be noted that this could work against us if they do not actually support our cause. So that's something we need to actually go out to the sites and determine whether or not they will. And something to note is that all of these factors were normalized on a national average. So the national average would be a 1, and then these numbers judge whether they are higher or lower than the national average. And next up will be Sydney to talk to you about these social factors.
So the social factor that we used overall to determine our site selection was an aggregated social factor based off the 3 social factors that Kyle just talked about. So for example, for Boise Cascade Paper Solutions, which is now Cascade Tissue Group, it received a poverty score of 1, and it received a Creative Vitality Index score of -3, and this is on a scale of -5 to 5, and a social capital score of 0. We scaled all of these by equal weights, so each of those 3 scores was weighted equally at 0.33, and created to create the social factor score as seen here. So this is a map for the conversion plant, the liquids depot, that layers all of our base maps that Kyle talked about in one map. So here we are seeing all the factors together in one place. The transparencies are based on the weights given to them. So for example, type of facility very highly, so it will show up darker on the map. For example, electricity rates, which was rated comparatively lower. As you layer them, some spots will come out as dark hotspots, which are places that we would most like to consider site selection, and those have been circled in red here. Now the dots that you're seeing on the screen that are green are actually site locations, and they were given a 20 miles, and then there was a radius of 5 miles that went around the rails that you can see on the map, and then the highways received a radius of 2 miles. This is the same map of all of our integrated biorefineries. In this case, the main difference is that instead of considering distance from a pre-conversion deep solids depot site, that has been replaced with a biomass availability, and then the weights have been changed accordingly. And up next is Anna.
Bringing it all together with our maps and our justifications and our ranking, we got a top 10 for our conversion plant sites. These include ExxonMobil, Billings, Cenex Pipeline, and Georgia Pacific Paper. Just to note, these are preliminary sites because, as you can see, the natural gas, we don't have data yet for it, and we're continuing to work with the other team to come up with a better list of sites. Top 3 for integrated biorefinery include Georgia Pacific, once again, Cosmo Specialty, and Cascade Tissue Group. This is just a Pacific Northwest. You kind of notice we get a cluster around the Portland area and along the coast of Washington. The red dots are the conversion depot top sites, and the blue dots are the IBR top sites. The next are our process include contacting our top for evaluation, continuing to work with the other group to further refine our top sites, getting down to whether we want an integrated biorefinery, IBR, or a conversion plant, and also getting that natural gas data to get those better sites. We would love to answer any questions you guys may have.
Again, thanks for coming into the presentation here. We're going to take questions here from the Solids team, Depot team in just a second here. This is just a reminder, if you guys do have any questions for the conversion team based on the last portion of the presentation, go ahead and send those in. Again, that link's right underneath there. So I'll welcome one of the representatives from the Depot team to go ahead and answer a few of the questions that did come in. So if you back off, or you can just answer from that screen.
All right. And we had a few questions that when doing our presentation, and if we don't answer you directly, feel free to contact us and those questions. And so one of the questions we had was how do around the ports? And so we got those by additional research we've done, and we found that after 18.5 miles of going from truck to another form of transportation, then it no longer becomes economic. So we see a factor, our break-even point at 18.5, and then linearly went to on-site and linearly went out to 5, a negative 5 value. And so that's how we got our buffers around our port. We had another question on if we did any study or research into environmental constraints and water rights and those sorts of things. And I'd like to address that this first process is more of a scoping. So we're going to get our sites and preliminarily rate those different sites. But we still need to go into each of those sites and look at the factors and get more details into that. And those are things that we will look into as we're doing that. And we assume permitting would be about the same across the board, across the 4-state region, but that's something that we could find is not true. So those are something that we address in the next process. Another thing we had was about the benefits of using tribal land, those things. And so currently working with Laurel James, the gap between the tribal lands and our research. And so she will be able to, we have not currently contacted her about the different benefits of the tribal Right now, those are just clumped together with lands that we can use. And so those are RINS credit lands or RSF2 lands. And so we did use tribal lands, but we didn't look specifically into the benefits of those lands. And so another thing I wanted to clarify is that so with our solids depot, we're looking to have 3 to 4 at the working at the rates of 250,000 bone dry tons per year. And then those would be feeding a conversion facility or a liquids depot. And so that's what we'll be working at as far as volumes. And I think that's all of the questions that we were going to address. And please feel free to contact us with questions you have. Thank you.
So one more time, I just want to say thanks everybody for tuning in. Looks like we had about 30 of you guys come in for the presentation. At this point, there's no questions on the conversion side, and so we'll go ahead and contact you specifically if you guys did ask a question on that. We'll get back to you based on some of the information that came in. So thanks again for tuning in, and look forward to any other information you guys might give. You can either email me, kolson@wsu.edu, that's KOLN@wsu.edu, or go ahead and fill out that comments and questions form, and we'll go back to you on some of that information. So again, thank you for your time, and we will let you know what's next.